Thank you very much, Yolanda, for that introduction. I'm glad you mentioned that Rueben Lifuka. I've been accosted by a number of people who've called me Your Excellency, and I've had to remind them I'm in no way President Felix Tshisekedi of the DRC. We probably just look alike. But if you insist on calling me Your Excellency, I will take it. So good afternoon, distinguished guests and delegates to the 20th International Anti-Corruption Conference. We've just witnessed a wonderful opening ceremony. And now we are ready with the start of an opening plenary. And this opening plenary will help to unpack the theme for this conference, Uprooting Corruption, Defending Democratic Values. And I have a number of distinguished speakers on this panel, and they'll help to bring to light different aspects of how we can defend democratic values in order to uproot corruption in its various forms. So I have a very rare privilege and honor to moderate this panel, and I'll introduce the panelists who will come later on, but we have 4 segments to this. But we'll have President Maia Sandu of Moldova, Ms. Samantha Power, the USAID Administrator, Mr. David Mopas, President of the World Bank Group, Ms. Gada Fatih Wali, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, Executive Director, but here also representing the UN Secretary General, Mr. Achim Steiner, the UNDP Administrator, Ms. Rhoda Weeks Brown, IMF General Counsel and Director of the IMF Legal Department, and Mr. Sanjay Pradhan, the Chief Executive Officer of the Open Government Partnerships. Like I said, we're going to structure this opening plenary into 3. So first and foremost, we'll have some remarks, keynote remarks made by the USAID Administrator, Samantha Power, followed by President Sandu. That's in the first segment. And in the second segment, I will have a conversation with the rest of the panelists. And in the third segment, we will open up for a few questions and answers from the audience, and we'll talk about how we're going to do that at a later stage. So to proceed to the first segment, let me invite to the podium. I was going to do an elaborate overview of the presenters, but in the interest of time, since we're a few minutes behind time already, I have the honor and privilege to invite Ms. Samantha Power to the podium. She's the 19th Administrator of USAID. Ms. Power, please come to the podium to make your brief remarks. A round of applause for her.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great privilege to be among you. I'm a great admirer of the work that so many of you are doing. Not least Rueben, thanks for welcoming me and for organizing this forum. I had the great pleasure of joining Rueben for a discussion last year at the UN General Assembly on the frontiers of anti-corruption, and that has really informed my thinking and that of USAID as an institution as we think about the adjustments that we need to make. Today, as you all know, corruption is no longer just about individual autocrats pilfering the nation's wealth to live large. It is about their building out an entire system of governance, aided by facilitators beyond their borders. It's about taking advantage of an opaque global financial system to pillage on a grand international scale with the help of a new industry of these shadowy facilitators. And it's about using corruption to influence the politics and the policies of other countries and to reshape global norms and influence multilateral institutions in a manner that is seen to be serving their interests. Today, I'm going to do 2 things. I will discuss the ways that the United States is radically adapting our approach to tackle the corruption of today and tomorrow. Corruption that is systemic in nature, facilitated by shadowy external forces, and instrumentalized transnationally by autocrats to secure those political and policy aims. I will also discuss the efforts that all of us in this fight, governments, civil society, the private sector, and everyone watching online today, should embrace to defeat it. It turns out that one of the most vivid, ghastly totems of modern corruption is a 350-acre estate that sits just 15 miles outside Kiev. By now, many of you are familiar with this estate. It is sort of the stuff of legend in such circles as these. The opulent grounds on this estate feature a private golf course, impeccably manicured gardens, and even a small zoo with peacocks and giraffes. At its center sits a large mansion. Its garage features dozens of rare cars. Its sinks are gold-plated, and its chandeliers, which are also gold, cost $41 million. This complex, known as Mezihirya, was home to Viktor Yanukovych for 12 years when he was Ukraine's prime minister and president. While in office, his lavish lifestyle was no secret to the public. Ukrainians watched him take his private helicopter to work, and reporters had an open competition to unearth details of the opulence inside this home. But what were more inconspicuous were the billions of dollars he stole and hid around the world. It is estimated that while in office, Yanukovych and his cronies extracted as much as $37 billion worth of Ukraine's wealth, leading a system of oligarchs who leached off the state, while much of the loot was hidden away in Russia and in Western countries. This was money meant for roads and bridges, for medicines and at public clinics, for paying teachers. Instead, it was used to pay the vet bills for exotic fish. And Yanukovych was able to traffic in this corruption only because powers outside of Ukraine helped make him president. With $10 billion in loans from bankers close to Vladimir Putin, Russian oligarchs funded Yanukovych's 2010 election bid. In return, Yanukovych oriented Ukraine away from the West, signing a lucrative gas deal with Russia and even accepting an economic bailout from Moscow instead of the European Union. Many Ukrainians saw this as a blatant betrayal of the country's interests in favor of Russia's interests, and ultimately, of course, it sparked the revolution of dignity. Yanukovych's story illustrates the features of modern corruption, the corruption all of you are doing so much to try to combat. Yanukovych didn't simply try to enrich himself. He used his position to create a system of entrenched corruption in key industries like energy and real estate, capturing the levers of state power for political control, a system known well as kleptocracy. Rather than being constrained by how many assets he could buy up with stolen money in his own country, he invested his wealth abroad with the help of facilitators. In fact, in recent years, an entire sinister industry of these middlemen has arisen, standing ready to move illicit funds through a complicated network of shell companies laundering the money to hide billions in the hope that law enforcement and activists or journalists can't find it. Yanukovych and his circle used offshore companies prolifically, with one of his cronies setting up 26 shell corporations in the British Virgin Islands in 2012 alone. And of course, Yanukovych's corruption was never about Ukraine alone. It was about Russia. Putin is threatened by democratic advances, especially in his neighborhood. He feels stronger when democracies grow weaker, when they become more polarized, or when repression becomes more common. The more leverage Putin has over the leaders of countries at the UN, the more he can use that leverage to swing votes and to silence criticism of Moscow's aggression. The weaker the rule of law and the more centralized power is in developing countries, especially resource-rich countries, the easier it is for the Kremlin to cook up a deal to plunder natural resources. When Russia funds pro-Kremlin media outlets and issues loans to sympathetic political parties, like the National Rally, formerly known as the National Front in France, Moscow benefits. It is no coincidence that the National Rally recognized Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea. The People's Republic of China is well versed in using corruption to further its interests abroad, especially in extractive industries and infrastructure. Using their Belt and Road Initiative, China often exerts its power by offering corrupt favors in exchange for preferential investments and control. In Malaysia, for instance, after former Prime Minister Razak was caught red-handed funneling state money into his personal bank account, he struck a deal with Beijing. The PRC would attempt to influence investigators to drop their probes, even offering to spy on reporters who helped leak the scandal, in exchange for stakes in massive rail and pipeline infrastructure projects in Malaysia as part of the Belt and Road. Systematization, facilitation, instrumentalization of corruption to obtain political benefit abroad, these are the qualities, the faces of modern corruption. And the impact this hyper-powered corruption is having on international development is staggering. The UN estimates that corruption costs the developing world $1.26 trillion each year, which is a staggering 9 times the amount of all the official development assistance provided each year. 9 times that amount. In global health alone, Transparency International estimates that number is 500 billion. The pandemic, of course, only fueling that number's rise, both in the West and elsewhere. And women and marginalized groups, including the LGBTQI community, often bear the brunt of corruption. To respond, the United States has raced to alter our approach, to meet the modern conditions of corruption, the modern qualities and faces of corruption. The Biden-Harris administration, as I know you've heard, became the first in history to identify corruption as a core national security interest. At USAID, as many of you know, one of my first steps as administrator was to stand up an anti-corruption task force led by Shannon Green, not just to lead our current efforts, but in truth, to transform our thinking. And today, this very day, I am excited to launch USAID's first ever anti-corruption policy. This new policy is going to guide our revamped approach, emphasizing that corruption is not just something that happens within a country, but it is something exacerbated by global trends and perpetuated by global networks that include criminal syndicates and trafficking rings. It orients our focus upstream toward the most damaging kinds of corruption, when corrupt officials use their political power to steal their nation's wealth. It also compels us to try to address corruption across every sector in which we work and attack it from every angle. At the core of this new approach, to be specific, is our flagship Transforming the Fight Against Corruption initiative, which refocuses our efforts to address corruption that occurs at the highest levels of government, spills across borders, and is the very foundation of kleptocracy. This initiative is designed to block corrupt actors from siphoning off their nation's wealth and help shield our partner countries from corrupt internal and foreign influence. It has 3 components. First, we want to reduce opportunities for corruption in the first place, both domestic and transnational. Second, where corruption does occur, we want to raise its cost to deter it, including by funding global networks of investigative journalists and activists who can help expose complex, multi-country schemes. And third, we want to incentivize good behavior and integrity so that upstanding public servants are rewarded And private sector leaders are making decisions that improve anti-corruption efforts rather than exacerbating them. Let's start with reducing opportunities for corruption. We know that the most effective period that countries have to pass meaningful anti-corruption reform is within the immediate, narrow window following a democratic breakthrough, within the first 18 to 24 months of a major political transition. To help local champions take advantage of these novel opportunities, we have launched a new anti-corruption response fund. Already, we have put it to good use. When President Abinader of the Dominican Republic came to power, pledging to fight corruption, we were able to support his administration as they pursued ethics reforms for public officials, as well as really important procurement reform. We've also introduced a new global accountability program, which is aimed at strengthening government systems in our partner countries so that they have greater capacity to detect and root out corruption, coming from within their own borders, and again, to stress, also from without. In Moldova, for example, and you'll hear soon from the great President Sandu, USAID worked with the Central Electoral Commission and political parties to encourage greater transparency in financial disclosures so that external actors who are looking to manipulate and exert influence over Moldovan politicians cannot hide their contributions. And perhaps most relevant to preventing corruption is getting ahead of what might become its biggest source in the future, the global green mineral supply chain. As countries mobilize to rapidly transition to clean power, the demand for the minerals needed to power solar panels, wind turbines, and more efficient batteries is skyrocketing. But many of these resources come from countries where corruption is rampant. Instead of these resources enriching citizens, which is so long overdue, they have the potential to become the latest resource curse. Just weeks ago, following COP27, we issued the Green Minerals Challenge, calling for solutions to help us detect and prevent corruption in this emerging supply chain. We will grant up to 10 winning submissions up to $400,000 each and offer them targeted support to help turn their ideas into reality. We're still accepting submissions for this challenge until January 9th, and to apply, anyone can go to challenge.gov. To raise the cost of corruption, we are doubling down on efforts to support investigative journalists with the resources they need. In Europe, we helped support the Swiss Secret Project, which reviewed complicated records from one of the largest ever Swiss bank leaks. That investigation revealed a number of corrupt actors across Eastern Europe, including a Serbian drug lord with political ties, the sons of an Azerbaijani strongman, and Venezuelan businessmen who looted the country's oil wealth, even as the country descended further into humanitarian crisis. In Latin America, we helped create secure platforms so investigative journalists across the region can collaborate on cross-border investigations. We need so much more of this. As a result of this connectivity, journalists have produced hundreds of investigative pieces on environmental degradation, corruption, and money laundering, uncovering over $280 million in mismanaged public funding. But as we adapt our tactics to expose modern-day corruption, so too have oligarchs and autocrats shifted their tactics to discredit and silence their critics, including many in this room. They are combining old tricks, like paying off dissenters and jailing critics, with newer tactics, like running smear campaigns against activists or digitally surveilling opposition leaders and even peaceful protesters online. In particular, journalists today say that the biggest hurdle to their work is actually not the death threats that they receive or the intimidation, which of course can be devastating, but the lawsuits brought against them by corrupt actors, which can cost millions, which the corrupt actors can afford, and it can put these incredibly important outlets out of business. For instance, a small investigative journalism organization based in Serbia that we at USAID support, called CRIC, is currently dealing with 11 lawsuits costing $1 million. That is more than 3 times their annual budget. The same pattern is happening all around the globe. So, we at USAID have designed a new insurance fund called Reporters' Shield that investigative journalists and civic actors around the world can use to defend themselves against expensive, bogus lawsuits. Journalists can begin enrolling for coverage next spring and will begin receiving services in the summer. Reporters' Shield is launching thanks to the partnership with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and the Cyrus R. Vance Center for International Justice, but we are still searching for partners to provide both funding and technical expertise. So here I call upon all those who care about media freedom to join us in providing support. Finally, we're incentivizing the kind of honest behavior in the public and private sectors that can serve as an alternative to corruption. After Vice President Harris issued a call to action for international and local companies to increase investments in Northern and Central America, more than 40 companies and organizations stepped forward to commit more than $3.2 billion to expand economic opportunity. Just as important, though, the companies making these new investments are being vetted for high standards of transparency, human rights, and labor rights. Endemic corruption has hindered, is hindering economic development in Northern Central America. And in many places in that region, it is getting worse. The private sector must be part of the solution. In Zimbabwe and Liberia, we support a creative program that rather than seeking to name and shame corrupt actors, practices with which we are familiar and believe in, this program names and fames honest actors. Integrity Icon recognizes and profiles bureaucrats who are defying the odds to serve the public interest, detailing their stories on TV and radio. Each episode helps dispel the myth that corruption in government is inevitable and celebrates those devoted to true public service. Each plank of our new strategy, reducing corruption, raising its costs, and incentivizing good behavior, is key. But no matter our strategy, we have to wrestle with the tensions that come with providing life-saving services in highly corrupt environments. In every setting in which we work, USAID takes exhaustive steps to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. And often what that means in situations where corruption is rampant is that we avoid working with governments and local NGOs that we fear to be corrupt, circumventing them to deliver assistance. For instance, in Sudan, after the military takeover last year, we conducted an in-depth analysis to better understand who was controlling key industries. Such analyses leave us better positioned to channel aid through partners who are playing a constructive role. But avoiding this corruption, rather than working to address it, is untenable, and it breeds dependence. Because what that means in practice is often creating what we all know too well, which is parallel systems of delivering aid in perpetuity, never allowing for the type of local ownership of humanitarian and development work that is most sustainable. In settings where lives literally hang in the balance, we must not only track how much food we deliver, how many shots we get in arms, but also work to make the procurement, logistics, and personnel systems of the local government, including those we are not using, more accountable and effective. We can scale up the kind of analyses done in Sudan so we have a better sense of our options for local vendors and can avoid indirectly feeding corrupt networks. The trucking company we employ may be clean, but if it's owned by the president's nephew, we've got a little more digging to do. Grappling with corruption, even in these life and death humanitarian emergency circumstances, is something we need to do openly. We need to honestly discuss with our local partners and with other donors and lending institutions. Very much looking forward to hearing from David Malpass imminently here today. If we hope for this to be an impactful effort, it has got to be collective. And the same is true when it comes to tackling the modern face of corruption. Corrupt actors thrive when we stick to our silos instead of building bridges across sectors, across geographies, across stakeholders. Citizens everywhere, from Iraq to Armenia and even Russia and China have protested in recent years against the actions of autocrats and oligarchs. People have turned out in record numbers to elect candidates running on anti-corruption platforms, candidates like President Abinader, President Hichilema in Zambia, and of course, President Sandu. These windows of opportunity open suddenly, but they are fleeting. Ukraine faced a similar window of opportunity in the wake of the Revolution of Dignity, and here I will close. Ukraine threw off the yoke of corruption and rejected autocrats who were luxuriating in the privacy of their estates while the basic needs of Ukrainians were not being met. And in the years since, they have ushered in a wave of institutional innovation and reform. With America's support, they have established specialized anti-corruption institutions that have turbocharged the way Ukraine prevents and investigates corruption. These institutions are young. They have a long way to go. Ukrainian civil society activists and officials, I think, would be the first to admit, but they have helped foster greater confidence from businesses to invest. They've fostered better public services for citizens, and generally, public trust in government has improved. All moves, we know, that infuriated Vladimir Putin and indeed helped motivate him to launch this war, as he realized, with this rule of law being strengthened, that his grip on this neighboring country was slipping. He specifically cited Ukraine's anti-corruption bodies in his television address, justifying the invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine's fight today is, of course, against an invading army, but their insistence on strengthening their institutions and batting down corruption has helped fuel their remarkable defense of democracy, especially at the grassroots level. In that post-revolution period, after the Maidan, Ukraine made one other decision to fight corruption. After Yanukovych fled, the question of what to do with the Mezhihirya estate arose. Should it be shuttered? Should its assets be sold off? Remember those sinks and those chandeliers. Should it be reclaimed, restored as a government building belonging to the public? No, Ukrainians decided. It should become a museum of corruption, a stark reminder of how much Ukrainians would lose if kleptocrats and corrupt actors were ever allowed to seize power again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Administrator Power. Thank you for highlighting the work that you're doing at USAID. I was thinking, how do I bring to attention that she's almost run out of time, but she already told you that she's a friend of mine, so that's not corruption. So with those remarks from USAID, it's now my honor to introduce Honorable Maia Sandu, who is the first female president of Moldova and has been in that position since December 2020. And she is a former leader of the Party of Action and Solidarity and a former prime minister, but also previously served as Minister of Education. So, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming to the podium President Sandu.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, I am impressed by so much expertise in this room. It gives us strong hope for progress in our joint effort in fighting corruption. I would like to speak about three things today. First, fighting corruption is essential for preserving democracy. Second, political will to stop graft is very important. Third, established democracies require a rethink to deny criminals safe haven and not allow stolen funds to be used in their jurisdictions. Speaking from practical experience, I believe that fighting corruption is a fundamental and underappreciated value for a democracy. Democracy ends where impunity and tolerance of corruption begins. Democracies undertake determined efforts to root out corruption and change the way their societies operate. This creates room for progress and a just society which respects fundamental rights and freedoms and creates opportunities and prosperity. Authoritarian regimes are built on corruption, even though they often claim that democracies are too weak to effectively end it. In the real political world of young democracies, the fight against corruption is where your country's progress starts or where it can end, leading to enrichment of a select few and misery for the rest. My second point is that a serious movement inside the country to change, to evolve, to fight corruption is a prerequisite for progress. Graft, especially in political offices, has had a staggering effect on Moldova. In 2014, the country endured what had been the largest bank fraud in history relative to a country's GDP. Almost 12% of the country's GDP was stolen in a matter of several months. Think about all lost investments in energy, infrastructure, education, or healthcare. Around the same time, Moldova's parliament, government institutions, banks, and judges colluded to launder tens of billions in illicit financial flows from Russia. This is not just about lost opportunities to invest in the welfare of our citizens and stronger institutions. This undermined our national security and our democracy. I felt compelled to confront corruption head-on, and I can tell you that fighting it is not a simple choice. It carries significant personal and political costs because corrupt officials and their sponsors mobilize enormous resources to resist change. However, this is the only right and honest choice. Too many of the previous governments chose to stay aside, went for the low-hanging fruit, passed the problems to the next governments, and accepted corrupt geopolitical deals. For Moldova, it has become a road to a gray zone of lawlessness and lack of prospects. The universal rule is simple. If you really want to change your society, set it on a path towards sustainable development, you must have the guts to tackle corruption head-on, across the board, without compromises and tomorrows. You must do this decisively so that crooks get it, that change is real, and their corrupt ways will meet a firm response. You must mean it. When such strong political will exists in a country's leadership, the international community should be able to recognize it quickly and be ready to move fast to fully support it. Such political opportunities should not be missed. Our democracy is becoming stronger. This year's Global State of Democracy report highlights Moldova as a bright spot for democracy on the map of Europe. Moldova is in the top quarter of countries for representative government, equality, and social rights. Last year, Moldova went up 49 positions in the Press Freedom Index to rank 40th in the world. We are paying a high price for our progress towards an open and free society, Moldova today is under hybrid attack from Russia for refusing murky geopolitical deals, for firmly and unequivocally making a democratic pro-European choice. Just as in the case of Ukraine, Russia wants to arrest our progress towards free society. As we speak, corrupt groups supported by Russia use the funds stolen from the Moldovan people to undermine our reform efforts, to destabilize our institutions, incite violence, and topple a democratically elected pro-European government. This is the price we pay for choosing to fight corruption, to be democratic, pro-European, and standing against Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And the Moldovan people are resolute to defend our democracy and freedom to choose. Third, we need a major transformation to make sure that established democracies will not allow criminals or stolen money to feel safe in their jurisdictions. Loopholes are increasingly closed. From our experience, I can tell you that sanctions help. I salute in this context the decision of the US government to add to its sanctions list 2 notorious crooks and key organizers of the bank fraud, the 12% of GDP fraud, who are hiding abroad from Moldovan justice. Ending their ability to freely use stolen funds is a huge step towards bringing them to justice. I call on other countries to follow this lead. Asset recovery is now a fundamental goal for us. We need to do more at home, of course. Corruption has affected our law enforcement and the judiciary, and this complicates recovery of assets both domestically and in foreign jurisdictions. But we are changing this. The process of restoring the integrity and independence of our judiciary is well on its way. Some corrupt officials are under arrest. Some have fled the country. Some of the assets, like fraudulently snatched airport in the capital city, Chisinau, has returned now to the state and to the people. Yet, we cannot win this fight as long as some countries still allow easy movement of stolen funds and tolerate offshore and onshore havens. For example, most of the money from the $1 billion bank fraud and from Russia's money laundering schemes crossed Moldova's borders and continued into tens of jurisdictions in developed economies. If democratic states are serious about uprooting corruption, they should revise rules on stolen funds. And if democratic states are serious about helping fragile democracies recover faster after such significant flights of capital, they should revise their rules for asset restitution. We need other jurisdictions to work with Moldova's law enforcement bodies. We will progress in our fight against corruption when countries will no longer harbor fugitive criminals and assets stolen from other states. Joint work between our law enforcement agencies will send a clear signal that there is no place where ill-gotten gains could be hidden. Other jurisdictions should make proactive disclosures and, when possible, start their own investigations. And in addition to providing help to our law enforcement institutions, our partners sometimes should put additional resources domestically for their law enforcement bodies to better respond to mutual legal assistance requests for cooperation. The sheer scale of the financial crimes we're dealing with and the speed with which criminals use stolen funds to undermine young democracies should give us all a sense of urgency. I want to use this opportunity to recognize the tremendous contribution of the civil society and independent journalists to the fight against corruption. During the darkest times of state capture in Moldova, civil society and independent media continued to courageously expose the staggering scope of corruption to our citizens. Media investigations helped us mobilize public support for our fight against corruption and against the corrupt interest groups. Ladies and gentlemen, I conclude by expressing hope that this meeting of experienced and accomplished practitioners and civil society representatives will provide energy and new ideas to strip criminals of stolen assets and insulate our countries from further attempts to take much-needed resources away from our citizens. Democracies must make sure that hard-earned public funds benefit the public, not the criminals. In a globalized world, this is going to benefit everyone. I would like to thank everyone in this room for your contribution to the fight against corruption. And I would like to thank Moldova's partners, the US government, international organizations, non-government institutions in Moldova and abroad for helping us in fighting corruption in Moldova. Thank you.
So thank you very much, President Sandu, for those remarks and for the work that you're doing in Moldova. We thank you most sincerely. So we will move now to the next segment of our open plenary, and this is where we have a conversation with different thought leaders and leaders of organizations. I will introduce them and invite them to the podium. Firstly, Mr. David Malpass, the president of the World Bank Group. Mr. Malpass is the 13th president of the World Bank Group and started his 5-year term in April 2019. He has previously served as Under Secretary of the Treasury for International Affairs for the United States. Secondly, may I welcome to the podium Mrs. Gada Fati Wali, the Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and the Director General of the United Nations Office in Vienna. Before that, she did serve as Minister of Social Solidarity in Egypt. May I also welcome to the stage Mr. Achim Steiner. Mr. Achim Steiner is a UNDP administrator. He became administrator in June 2017, and he's just started his second term, having started that in June 2021. He's also the vice chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, which unites 40 entities of the UN system that work to support sustainable development. May I also welcome to the podium Ms. Rhoda Wicks-Brown, the IMF General Counsel and Director of the IMF Legal Department. She advises the IMF's Executive Board, Management and Staff and country membership on all legal aspects of the IMF operations, including its lending, regulatory and advisory functions. She previously served as Deputy Director in the IMF's Communication Department, where she led the IMF's communication and outreach in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Lastly, but not the least, Mr. Sanjay Pradhan, the Chief Executive Officer of the Open Government Partnership. Sanjay joined OGP as CEO in May 2016, and he leads a partnership of 77 countries, 106 local governments, and thousands of NGOs in the work around open partnerships. And Sanjay previously served as vice president in the World Bank, 3 vice presidential positions. So that will be my panel, and we will have a discussion. I know that Mr. Mopas and I believe Sanjay would have to leave us by 2:30, so but we'll see how we progress. Sanjay, is it 2:30? Yeah. Okay. All right, I was told I should take a seat. All right. Great, so we will start with a series of questions in this third segment. But I'll start with you, Mr. Mopas. The World Bank Group, as the world's largest development institution, in the years since your predecessor, James Wolfson's famous Council of Corruption speech, how has the World Bank Group changed its approach to corruption? And in particular, do democratic values shape the work of the institution? Mr. Mopas, please.
Thanks very much. I want to also thank Transparency International and the International Anti-Corruption Conference. It was really interesting to hear the remarks that have been made already. Democratic values are at the core of how the World Bank thinks about programs and operates. As we know, corruption presents a major threat to economic growth and to democratic stability around the world. It doesn't just add to the cost of projects, it changes the projects that are done in countries, it changes their design, and it ends up undercutting their effectiveness. So it's a huge challenge for our work in countries. Now we have the added challenge that interest rates are going up and prices are going up in countries, and the response has been often that people end up paying for I'll call them the corrupt or the arbitrary price controls that are being put in place, the subsidies, the currency depreciations that unfairly hit the poor in countries. They're paying also for the corruption of dual and multiple exchange rates and capital controls that are becoming increasingly apparent in development. Almost a quarter of the firms surveyed in the World Bank enterprise surveys expect to give gifts to secure government contracts, a quarter. And 30% of firms say corruption is a major constraint for doing business. So we have no doubt this is important. Jim Wolfenson called it the cancer of corruption. And I'll give you a little history. His efforts back then at the World Bank introduced anti-corruption policies that debarred contractors that were found guilty of corrupt activity. By the end of his term, similar mechanisms had been instituted across several of the MDBs, and the measures would also debar any company on a fellow agency's list. So if it's debarred in another MDB, it's debarred in the World Bank and vice versa. And this cross-debarment was a breakthrough at the time, and it's one that's valuable now for accountability and transparency. At the World Bank, the mechanism that operates that has been strengthened and expanded. It's vested now in the integrity vice president of the World Bank, which is Mahamadou Diagne. In FY22, the World Bank sanctioned 35 firms and individuals, of which 32 were debarred. And so, as I mentioned, that means debarring from all of the MDBs. An additional 72 firms were recognized for cross-debarment from other MDBs, and over 300 new external preliminary investigations were launched. So fighting corruption is in MDB contracts has been difficult, and I'll just go through very quickly 3 things that I think are important as we do this. One is transparency. So we have to find ways to confront the non-transparency of contracting going on, and we do that directly, but we recognize that non-disclosure clauses in contracts are a signal that there may be corruption underneath. Also, there's unsupportable collateralization of contracts that's been problematic, and also escrow requirements where the money leaves and before it goes to the intended, it goes through a sheltered account. IDA has a SDFP policy, the Sustainable Development Finance Policy, that prioritizes transparency, and so we work on an annual basis with IDA countries toward transparency. We practice that in the fight against COVID with vaccines, and our PPE spending was expanded dramatically, and we strongly advocated transparency in vaccine production, contracts, options, and donations and prices. So these were all major issues in the vaccine efforts. We're doing it also in various aspects of climate change. So I'll just mention one. To fight greenwashing, we are working to lay the groundwork for high-quality carbon credit markets. To do that, we're going to have verifiable emission reduction credits. We are beginning that process, and we have proposed a major trust fund scale that would take on these challenges to create verifiable emission reduction that actually leads to reduction in greenhouse gas emission. I repeat that because of the greenwashing, the difficulties that the world is having in actually taking steps that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A second area, so in addition to transparency, we want to present and provide data. That's very important, and the evidence, and so I'll just mention some of our initiatives. One is called GovTech, one is called CivTech. They provide innovations so that countries can enhance individual voices. We have another called ProAct, the Procurement, Anti-Corruption, and Transparency, which the data is related to, so we're putting together data that covers 21 million contracts across 120 countries. So data is important in the fight against corruption, as people know. This year, and I'll mention STAR, the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. It's in partnership with the United Nations. With the United Nations. This initiative assists countries to achieve accountability, recover stolen public assets, and repair the damage from corruption. In 2021 alone, 18 countries received STAR assistance, 5 countries adopted new laws or amendments, and over 1,800 people were trained by the initiative. And third, I'll mention the strong rule of law, which is important and at the core of World Bank programs. There's a patchwork of enforcement, and that undercuts even as countries put in place strong anti-corruption laws, there's inconsistency in the application and implementation of those laws, which undercuts their effectiveness. One of the things we're doing is working with FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, on ways to implement and improve the regulatory authorities for countries as they fight corruption. I was very pleased yesterday to meet with the World Bank's governance practice. We have a very large governance practice headed by Arturo Herrera. I think he may be in the audience. Stand up if you are, Arturo. But the large practice works in over 100 countries to help improve governance and procurement practices and to fight corruption. So it's an area of the bank that we're building out and strengthening. So let me just reiterate that the World Bank is making every effort to combat corruption, strengthen good governance, and build a solid foundation of trust and accountability. We won't tolerate corruption in the projects that we support. I'd like to particularly acknowledge our joint efforts with UNODC, with the Open Government Partnership, our work with USAID and UNDP, and also U.S. leadership of this conference today in hosting IACC. And we welcome very much the opportunity to work with all of you here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malpas. You mentioned UNODC, and that's a nice segue to talk to Executive Director Wally. As the head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, your office is uniquely positioned to address corruption and its links with organized crime and terrorism. I believe you have 133 officers working out of more than 100 countries. Could you tell us how you see the situation on the ground? What must be done to better fight corruption both locally and globally?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. We have been listening to very inspiring speeches. President Sandu, colleagues at the podium, let me start by thanking organizers, Transparency International, and also the United States government for hosting this event and also for hosting next year Conference of the States Parties. Next year, the conference will be held in the UN, in the US, and it's the UN UNCAC, which is will be the 20th anniversary of the conference, the UNCAC. So it is happening at a very, very opportune time. The world is suffering from the impact of the pandemic and from the worst global economic outlook for decades, which makes it crucial for all of us to ensure that the money needed for economic development and public services like schools, hospitals, and other services is not drained by corruption. Let me tell you that in Africa alone, illicit financial flows are estimated at about $50 billion a year, and globally the amounts lost to corruption are much, much more than what is ODA and what is needed to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we are saying is that we cannot afford to continue doing business as usual, and I will tell you what can we do in 3 specific areas, both in the countries that we work in the field, at the regional level, but also globally. First, we need a renewed commitment to the international cooperation, including through implementation of the Convention Against Corruption. As I said, this is a convention where 189 countries are parties, and 150 countries have gone through a peer review mechanism and have identified the gaps that are needed to address. So in our office at UNODC, we support 185 countries out of the 189 to prevent and take legal action against corruption through the convention and through its tools. Next year, with the 20th anniversary, it will be a good opportunity to renew the commitment and to look at all the achievements, look at the best practices, look at what countries have achieved, and exchange those experiences and make sure that there is an anti-corruption instrument. And this has brought together every single country and offered an agreed upon blueprint for nations to bolster their responses both domestically and internationally. However, as has been said by several speakers, there is a big gap between commitments and implementation. So what we need to focus on in the period to come is implementation of those commitments, is providing the needed capacity building for those commitments, and to look at the results of the formal review mechanisms to the convention and focus on international cooperation in this area to see what countries are in most need of assistance, what areas where we need to provide assistance. Governments are looking for ways to strengthen efforts to collectively prevent and counter what has become more and more a transnational phenomenon at a time when governments are facing a diminishing fiscal space and debt crises in many, many countries of the world. So this is the time for countries to really address issues of corruption. There are a number of aspects of the convention where we need to do far more. Whistleblower protection, accountable and transparent public procurement, international cooperation, asset recovery are all areas where implementation is lacking globally. So first point is implementing the convention. Second is trust. Trust needs to be reestablished between leaders and citizens. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has spoken about a trust deficit disorder, something which is becoming ever more apparent and divides our society and is widening the divides in our societies. So amidst the growing social discontent seen daily across the globe, we know that corruption is a major factor in this, politicians distorting electoral processes, officials pocketing stolen funds with little or no resources, business leaders circumventing the laws, escaping justice. The results are the same: massive, massive societal discontent and a worsening trust deficit. So work on building trust between leaders and citizens is very important to address corruption. Third, we need to build greater collaboration through multi-sectoral and anti-corruption coalitions. In order to truly counter corruption at the myriad forms it can take, we must inspire and engage the whole of society to tackle corruption. So here it's important to involve the private sector, civil society, educators, academics, think tanks, and media need to be involved in anti-corruption efforts. Women, very important player, must be included. Youth need to be engaged and empowered to become leaders and partners to better fight corruptions. So ladies and gentlemen, while we have outlined these 3 points as separate items, they cannot be seen in isolation from one another. So they are truly intertwined, and only by approaching our anti-corruption response with all these elements together, we can make a difference. And in these efforts, I think we need new initiatives. David has mentioned our partnership with the World Bank, the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative STAR. We also have, so I will not dwell on that, but I will mention UNODC's Global Operational Network for Anti-Corruption Law Enforcement Authorities, GLOBE-E, and this is a platform which connects 127 entities from 7 countries. It was launched in last June, and it is providing anti-corruption authorities easy access to contact points in other countries to exchange experiences, resources, and the tools needed to track, investigate, and prosecute cross-border corruption. Earlier, I have spoke about the need to safeguard our scarce global economic resources. So this is particularly the case at times of emergencies and recovery. Resources are scarce, fiscal space is limited, so we need to really look at integrity across every single sector. On the eve of the first COVID-19 vaccines being approved for use, UNODC had issued a policy paper on corruption risks in the manufacture and allocation and distribution of vaccines. That paper has been downloaded from the website on that day 150,000 times. So there is a need for policy recommendations, for reports, for data, for information, and for policy guidance. Last year, we published a guide to promote reporting on corruption in the healthcare sector and to protect whistleblowers. And we have active projects to increase transparency that focus on emergency procurement in the healthcare sector in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Indonesia, Paraguay, Philippines, South Africa, and Timor-Leste. So we need to work with the countries at the country level. We also need to work regionally and create regional hub where regions can exchange experiences and exchange best practices. While tackling corruption is the responsibility of the states and the governments, it will never be achieved in a vacuum. So we will be organizing regional dialogues for civil society, youth, and academia to develop recommendations on how to accelerate the implementation of the Convention and the political declaration adopted by the UN General Assembly Special Session on Corruption, which took place in 2021. We also have increasingly bolstered our partnership with the private sector to help businesses, in particular small businesses, identify and mitigate corruption risks. SMEs are very important and sometimes are paying the price of corruption. So we know that public procurement is a serious corruption risk. Thank you. Is a serious corruption risk, and even using the most conservative estimates, 8% of the value of procurement contracts, more than 5 times development aid disbursed in 2019 was lost to corruption. So for companies to be able to operate successfully in a business environment in which corruption is not tolerated, it's essential that the next generation of business leaders understand the risk of corruption and the international instruments which guide national anti-corruption efforts. So we have a global integrity education project which equips university graduates with the knowledge and ethical perspectives at the start of their careers to help them become a force for business integrity in their future workplaces. And to date, more than 30,000 students from universities in Kenya, Mexico, Pakistan have been taught the UNODC University Integrity modules. So you have to work with communities, with youth, with women, with civil society, with governments. It's a whole of society approach. Last but not least, we have youth empowerment initiatives, and here we need to start with children, and in schools introduce curriculum and introduce activities that educate and instill the values of integrity. To close, I started my remarks by outlining 3 key areas that I believe are essential to our joint goal of effectively tackling corruption, enhancing international cooperation and implementation of the Convention, re-establishing trust, and forging new coalitions. And on all 3 dimensions, I look forward to strengthen our partnership with everyone present here and to continue working with all member states to implement the UNCAC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll change the rules a little bit because I believe Mr. Mopus has to leave and Sanjay. So maybe, Sanjay, since you are very eager to co-create the presentation with the Executive Director, Wali, let me call upon you, Sanjay. You lead OGP, a partnership of 77 countries, thousands of civil society organizations. Yet, despite you doing all this, corruption remains a vexing challenge. And this year's IACC underlines how corruption also poses a threat to democracy. What different approaches do you think we should follow to credibly tackle these challenges? What are some of the inspirational examples from OGP that illustrate these ways forward?
Thank you, Rueben. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's wonderful to see so many of you in 3 dimensions again. We meet at a time when corruption not only remains an enduring challenge, but also poses unprecedented threats to democracy. Internal threats, from plummeting citizen trust in government, which citizens perceive to be corrupt and captured. External threats, from oligarchs continuing to enrich themselves with impunity and undermining democracy across borders. But right here at this IACC and beyond, we have courageous reformers inside and outside government fighting back. So let me suggest, Rueben and everyone, 5 priorities through which, and if I can just stand because I can't see everyone, 5 priorities through which we can collectively marshal all your efforts to more credibly combat corruption and defend democracy. First priority, let us together open up opaque public institutions and empower citizens to shape and oversee their government. In Ukraine, amidst scandalous tales of powerful oligarchs siphoning public resources, which Samantha spoke about, young reformers joined hands after the Maidan revolution to disclose previously opaque contracts as open data, saving $1 billion and 80% of businesses reporting reduced corruption. During the pandemic, while New York paid exorbitant prices through an opaque contract for ventilators which were never even delivered, Moldova, President Sandu, by contrast, disclosed its emergency COVID contracts as open data which civil society monitors. Today, 70 OGP governments have committed to open contracts. Let's work together to ensure credible implementation and make open contracts a new global norm. While advancing grand corruption, we must also empower citizens to tackle corruption which impacts their daily lives. Through Panama's 311 hotline, citizens have submitted 18 million complaints, of which the government has responded to 90%, resolved 90% of them. Italy has launched school competitions to mobilize student auditors. Kaduna, Nigeria has launched a mobile app to empower citizens to provide feedback on public services. We call this democracy beyond the ballot box, where citizens shape and oversee their governments every day, not just once a few years when we cast our vote. But this requires protecting civic space, which has come under widespread assault, including in OGP countries. In the aftermath of the End SARS protests against police brutality in Nigeria, Reformers leveraged OGP to improve oversight of the police. Second priority, to tackle external threats from kleptocrats undermining democracy, of which Russia's invasion of Ukraine is only the most egregious. Let us together advance a new global norm to end anonymous companies. Today, 34 OGP countries, including Armenia, Slovakia, and the UK, are advancing beneficial ownership transparency. But we have some recent reversals due to the recent European Court of Justice ruling. We must together keep pushing and ensuring more companies step up to deny a safe haven for kleptocrats. Third priority, let us together strengthen multi-stakeholder platforms and coalitions fighting corruption. Experience from our own OGP 10-year experience shows that anti-corruption has become a central priority in OGP action plans. But importantly, when government co-creates actions with civil society, the reforms are more ambitious and the results are more stronger. So I call upon civil society to strengthen its engagement with OGP, with government reformers on the table for response and action. And to the point that President Sandu made earlier, to show, which she's about to leave,
Thank you,
but that's okay, we will support you nevertheless. She's awesome. So to advance ambitious reforms and visible results, we must mobilize collective support, as President Sandu was saying, in the narrow windows of opportunity when new and reformist governments with strong anti-corruption platforms come to power, as in Moldova, Malawi, or the Dominican Republic. This is a key emerging direction of OGP's new strategy. And then we must also empower and support local coalitions, such as the CTAP Civil Society Network in Africa, which is working with OGP governments to enhance fiscal disclosure, but then empowering citizens to follow the money and demand accountability. Fourth priority, let us together ensure that commitments made in global forums such as this, or the Summit for Democracy, or the G20, or the UN, don't just remain words on a communique or Twitter feeds, but translate into country actions. Following the London Anti-Corruption Summit, 20 OGP countries implemented their summit commitments through OGP action plans with civil society engagement. So let me end with a personal story. I grew up in Bihar, India's poorest and most corrupt state, where I saw my father, a government officer, fight a lonely battle against corruption. He insisted on awarding contracts using open tender, even though he was viciously attacked and threatened by powerful forces. He persisted out of his intrinsic commitment to integrity. Our traditional approach to fighting corruption focuses on external accountability, which is important. So our fifth priority, let us mount an equally ambitious collective effort with youth groups, education institutions, schools of government, faith-based institutions, to build and nurture values and ethics which Delia spoke about. And for this, I invite you to join me right here at IACC on Saturday at 11 a.m. for a fascinating conversation I will be hosting with Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, global humanitarian and renowned spiritual leader from India, with youth groups on values and ethics. Even after my father retired from government, he persisted as a civil society activist till at age 80. He litigated a final case against corruption. He won the ruling, but later that very day, he fell and he died. He fought till the very end, but he was a lonely warrior. At this IACC, let us connect lonely warriors, such as my father, but importantly, like many of you, so we can find collective strength and courage to advance ambitious reforms that combat corruption and deliver better democracy. Let us forge coalitions of integrity that overcome entrenched networks and culture of corruption. let us together deliver on that precious, precious promise, a government that truly serves its citizens rather than itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. Thank you, Sanjay, for that presentation. Sanjay decided to stand so that he wouldn't look at me as I tell him that time is running out, but that worked very well. But I'll turn to Achim Steiner, the UNDP Administrator. Mr. Steiner, the latest Human Development Report titled Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, Shaping Our Future in a Transforming World, clearly mentioned that 10 years ago, there were more countries where critical elements for democratic governance were improving than declining. Today, the situation is reversed. What part does corruption play in this wider decline? Mr. Stein.
Thank you, Ruben, and good afternoon to all of you. I think looking back 10 years tempts me for a moment to go back even more, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, because if you allow me, I want to begin with a tribute, which goes a little bit in the direction, Sanjay, that you just spoke. Here sit in front of me two people who have been sometimes these lonely warriors. Peter Eigen, who I met during my days in Washington, D.C., when, Peter, you were one of those who began to stand up, not with many others following initially, especially out of the community that you came from, and began to provide the beginnings of the Transparency International narrative. And here we are many years later, and I sit on the podium and I feel as if the conversation truly has moved on. Huguette Labelle, a dear friend of mine who invited me to one of these conferences when I was heading IUCN, I believe, and for me it was the connection between corruption, the environment, and natural resources and communities that at that time was the focus. And here we are in the year 2022. I have listened to many speeches today. I'm very pleased to be on this podium here together, and I have to say we have come a long way in understanding how corrosive corruption is, but we are also experiencing, to your point, the price of disruption, the price of crisis, the price of when governance systems begin to crack, when societies find themselves pushed back, whether it is in terms of democratic space, and I listened carefully also to the stories today of those who stand up, for example, as TI representatives or as part of maybe the OGP community and civil society, and clearly governments feel empowered in certain parts of the world to go after them. And I think all of this is indicative of the price we pay when a world finds itself in crisis. These are troubled times, and corruption thrives in troubled times. So the first thing I think we should acknowledge is that we have built many very solid foundations, narratives and networks, but we are living through a very troubled moment when it comes to continuing to advance the battle against corruption. But here let me also say the reason why ultimately those who want to push back will fail is that I think where we are today is in a much stronger place. We understand that corruption is not only an ad hoc phenomenon, it's a characteristic of systemic weaknesses. It is a reflection of societies that have not reached the point where it is simply unacceptable to do so. Remember, and that's why I often think also when we go to these conferences, everybody sits in a glass house somewhere. It's not so long ago that bribery was tax deductible in many of the G7 countries. This was the reality at the time. We have come a long way, and we are coming even further if we embrace that the battle against corruption is very much rooted in the ultimate conversation between citizens and their government, in governance, in the institutions of government, but also in the institutions of governance, the rule of law, the fundamental rights, the human rights that define a person's right to challenge maybe a senior government official who would like to take advantage of the system. Just briefly, in the work that I today have the privilege of leading in the United Nations Development Programme, very much alongside Garda Wali and many of our sister agencies who, in the United Nations, are daily confronted, first of all, with the challenge of corruption, and secondly, with also the pushback that we sometimes get. Our strategy today is to focus on making anti-corruption, the battle against corruption, integral to the governance work we do. Helping to strengthen, first of all, the legislation, the institutions, the link between also prosecution and the courts, because if there's no consequence to identifying corruption, it will simply continue. These are some of the building blocks of strengthening a more systemic and systematic approach, building both capacities in government, linking also the battle against corruption to sectors. David spoke briefly about climate change and the link between where we see corruption and integrity and validation really being a challenge right now. These are new markets, these are new players. Sometimes there is not even legislation that provides for the kind of transparency that is needed. These are all areas in which we invest. And a second and my last point will be, Nila, you alluded earlier on to technology, so did Huguet, on both ends of the spectrum. I happen to believe that there is a significant win-win in understanding how we can deploy technology, because we're able to monitor things today, we are able to create chains of custody, we are able to create links between the consumers and producers, we are able to empower the national policing and customs services in a way that simply was unimaginable 10 years ago. Part of that extends also to empowering civil society. One of the things we in UNDP are very privileged to do in Nepal, in Liberia, in Bangladesh, is, for example, to help the platforms for public reporting. We've already heard a few examples of that, where your father had to be a lonely warrior, in a sense, Sanjay. Today, 15-year-olds can go out and say, there is something wrong that's happening here, and I will report it on the platform. In Sri Lanka, we are working with the Sri Lankan government, particularly on environmental resource misuse and corruption in the way that natural resources are used. Citizens suddenly become an army of millions. And I think this is a very empowering part of trying to understand how technology can, with all the risks that it carries, and I echo Huguet's concerns also, become an integral part of the way we as development organizations can help governments and societies to actually create systems, the digital ecosystems that enhance transparency and make the battle against corruption so much more effective. I know you are pressed for time, so I will not take more time, but simply say it's a privilege to be here. It was for me personally also the invitation opportunity to come back and say thank you to all those who over years, over decades, have built the kinds of networks and platforms that allow us today to speak about this, not as an issue that we have to touch on the side. It's at the center of accountable government, of essentially the social contract within people and their governments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me now turn to Rhoda Weeks-Brown from the IMF. The IMF changed its approach to governance and anti-corruption issues a few years ago, more directly engaging in these areas. Rhoda, can you please share some insights from the fund's enhanced work in anti-corruption and the areas of focus to advance this agenda?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rueben. And first, let me just say how wonderful it is to be here, to see so many of you, including you, Rueben, who I saw not that long ago at the IMF annual meetings, but good to see you again. And really, thanks to TI, IACC, US government, for putting together such an amazing conference. I mean, listening to the speeches, chatting with people in the hallways, it really is amazing that we're all here to discuss this super important, indeed critical issue for our time. I also want to mention that I bring very warm greetings from our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva. She's been at these conferences before, as you know, and she very much wanted to be at this one, but she had prior travel commitments, so really she sends her very warm greetings. We've talked a lot about corruption and about the many different dimensions on which it's an important topic. From the IMF's perspective, of course, we bring the economic dimension. You know, Jake Sullivan talked at the beginning about the security dimension. Others have talked about human rights and health and other perspectives. The IMF's perspective is very much economic. And so in some ways, that makes this an even more profound issue for us, because right now, the world is at a juncture where the economic issues we're seeing are of a scale and a nature that we've really never seen before. And again, the idea that we're in a very shock-prone world right now, where we've had shock after shock, and every time you think you've responded to the first one, something else happens. Of course, I'm talking about first COVID, then the war in Ukraine. We've, of course, got also just environmental and climate issues of a wide range that's impacting every country, every continent in the world. No one has been exempt from that. We're also living in a world that's just more volatile, it's more uncertain, more fragmented. And all of this comes at a time when people everywhere are suffering from other kinds of economic difficulties, cost of living crisis, food shortages, inflation everywhere. So these shocks have inflicted, immeasurable, again, harm, economic harm on people. And in these challenging circumstances, the point is that we simply cannot afford to bear the massive negative consequences that come from corruption and from bad governance. So again, that's the approach that we bring to this in terms of the IMF. We also know from past experience that corruption frameworks, countries with strong institutions, strong corruption frameworks, are more able to respond effectively to challenges of the kind that I've just described than those who don't, and that you basically need to have that sort of response to address these circumstances we're looking at. So clearly, fighting corruption is critical for economic recovery, for stable and sustainable economic growth, and for the sort of poverty reduction that, again, has also taken a hit in the recent economic crisis. We've seen just reversals of decades of growth in reducing poverty and reducing inequality. So how does the IMF approach this, Rueben? Again, we're running out of time. I'll try to be very brief. But I'll mention first that this is not exactly a new issue for the IMF. The first policy we adopted was on governance. We called it the IMF's policy on governance, but was back in 1997. So that was quite a while ago. But what did we do under that policy? Again, we didn't address these issues in a very systematic way. We're not perhaps as direct as we could have been. Indeed, we barely used the C word, corruption. Was not a word that you saw frequently in our discussions, in our papers. This all changed in 2018. That's when the fund stepped back, took note of the significant importance of governance and corruption issues for the IMF's mandate. Again, macroeconomic stability, helping countries achieve strong and sustainable economic growth. We realized that unless we took a more direct and systematic approach to addressing corruption, that we couldn't accomplish that mandate. So in 2018, the IMF's executive board adopted what we called an enhanced framework for addressing issues of corruption and governance in IMF member countries. And I can assure you now proudly that the IMF no longer uses synonyms for corruption. We do use the word, we use it quite frequently, and we're engaging much more systematically in these issues in our member countries. This 2018 framework that we adopted, again, really just recognized that poor governance and corruption have significant direct and indirect economic and social costs, and that at the heart of it, again, it really does affect the IMF's mandate. And indeed, we've done tons of research. I won't get into all of it, but one statistic I thought I would mention, for example, is research estimating that tax revenues alone, lost globally on an annual basis only to corruption, so again, not to all the other nefarious things out there. This amounts to about $1 trillion annually. $1 trillion lost to tax revenues from corruption alone. And we also know that lower government revenues have a number of pernicious effects in themselves, because, again, then you have less spending on health and education, for example, which you all know is absolutely critical if we're going to reduce income inequality and reduce poverty. So, again, the 2018 framework basically recognizes that it's important to address anti-corruption as such, but this is really important. It's not only about criminal prosecutions, it's not only about criminal laws. Those things are important. But we also recognize that in many countries, there are inherent governance weaknesses, and those are the cracks through which corruption prevails in the first place. And so what areas am I talking about? Under this policy, we look at things like fiscal governance, for example. Again, in most countries, getting it right on things like PFM, on sort of basic fiscal governance issues, can have a huge effect in reducing corruption. Fiscal governance, central bank governance, of course, AML-CFT, the rule of law, absolutely critical, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So again, there are six functions that I looked at as a critical part of our efforts to address these issues of corruption. And so that has been the practice, Rueben, under the 2018 framework. to answer your question. I should also note that it's not only about the demand side, this is very important, it's also about the supply side and looking at issues of facilitation, looking at issues of anti-bribery, and so looking at what is happening in a lot of the larger countries around these issues. A very important part of what we do also is that we're looking at these issues in a systematic basis in the annual health checks that the IMF has. In that sense, we have a more powerful, I'll call it a commitment device, than many other IFIs and other international organizations have, because we engage regularly with countries, annually, having these discussions of economic issues, and discussing corruption and governance in that context can be very effective. You start the discussion this year, you have it again the next year, and we have these discussions routinely in all countries where we assess issues of governance and anti-corruption, governance and corruption to be severe. Where corruption is assessed to be severe, this is a regular part of our discourse in those countries. Of course, everyone thinks of the IMF and we think about lending, and so yes, we also do address these issues in the lending context. And I should also say that we provide also an extensive amount of capacity development to countries to help them build up their frameworks in these issues. One of the things I wanted to mention, just to give one example, relates, and again, President Sandu is no longer here, but I was going to talk about Moldova as an example of one of the many countries where we've had an extensive amount of engagement. Again, there, as is so often the case, having a reform-minded government is kind of one of the basic preconditions you need for this kind of work to be effective. And so in the case of Moldova, there's currently an IMF-supported lending program, but our work really with them started long before that, when before that program, we did with Moldova one of these in-depth governance diagnostics, we call it. It's a governance and anti-corruption diagnostic that looks in-depth at the range of issues in countries that have a bearing on anti-corruption and governance issues for that particular country. Of course, it varies from country to country, but it really is an in-depth diagnostic assessment that then provides the blueprint for implementing reforms. And that was done in Moldova, and that process is now underway with a number of reforms being implemented, including in the context of the current fund-supported program that I mentioned. And this is just one example. We're doing a lot of work right now also around fragile and conflict-afflicted states. Again, a very important focus for the IMF right now, recognizing the unique role that issues of governance and anti-corruption plays in those countries, and recognizing also the particularly costly and economically critical consequences that poor governance and corruption can have in fragile contexts. So the fund's approach with respect to FCS, fragile and conflict-afflicted states, recognizes that corruption is a driver of fragility, and hence that decisions on economic program design and conditionality needs to be informed by an assessment of who benefits in those fragile contexts, and therefore the role of institutions in these arrangements, and that unless you approach it in this sort of holistic way, it doesn't work. So that's been an important factor for us. And maybe the last thing I'm going to mention is just that this 2018 policy is relatively new. It has been vigorously enforced in the manner I just described, but we're also right now reviewing that policy to see what lessons we can learn to improve things even more as we go forward. So many of the CSOs, both global and local in this audience, have already been part of that process. We've reached out to solicit views from civil society and from others, again, both global and local, and we're in the process now of looking at those results. It will be discussed by our executive board next year, and again, I think we can always learn to do better, and we're hoping to do that. And maybe that's how I'm just going to close, to note the important role that civil society, media, and others play in our efforts. We view the input that we get from civil society as absolutely critical. It's how we, in some ways, got to where we are now, and we continue to view that input as vital, and to view CSOs as vital and critical partners in our governance and anti-corruption efforts. I also want to laud all of the international organizations that we work with very closely, including all of the ones on the podium here. And let me just close by reiterating the IMF's unwavering commitment to being a trusted partner in these mission-critical governance and anti-corruption reforms. As I said at the top, the economic, the social, and other costs of bad governance and corruption are massive, and even more so in the very difficult, troubled economic times that we face. And so if we can move the needle on this in a meaningful way, the benefits for the global economy, for individual countries, but this is critical, for the actual people in those countries, can be truly immense and can be truly impactful. And so therefore we must really, I don't think we have a choice, but to stay the course and to work together in this important area. And again, just to reiterate that the IMF is very much a partner and looks forward to working with all of you in these endeavors. I'll stop there. Right. Thank you, Rueben.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know we would have wanted to engage with the audience, but we're running out of time. We really are pressed for time. I'm sure there will be opportunities the next time for the audience members to participate. Just join me in thanking our very good panel, Sanji, Swali, Akim Steiner, Rhoda Wilkes. Thank you very much. I'll hand over back to Yola, the MC for this event. So thank you.
Thank you to Rueben, and thank you to our esteemed speakers. I know we're running a bit over time, so thank you for your patience. I'm sure we can all do with a cup of tea or coffee. So we'll be taking a short break, and we'll be back here at 3:15 for Plenary 1, Global Security Demands a Global Response. Thank you, and see you back here shortly.